Welcome back to another Trailkings podcast. Today is a new episode and we're talking about dual rate spring versus single rate spring setup on your side-by-side. Stick around to the end and we'll give you our thoughts and what our preferences are between the two. As always, please show your support by hitting the subscribe button and clicking the bell icon to turn on notifications. All right, dual rate spring versus single rate spring and two spring single rate. What is it? How does it work? I'm gonna go to our expert.
No, you're not. Since I'm an expert, I'd like to give you an opportunity to show off your knowledge no, I can walk through my understanding of it. You can tell me if I'm wrong. You have more experience.
Yeah, I'll tell you how bad you're off.
So a single spring or single rate is one spring preloaded, like what comes on, or what came, I guess my old Rzr would be the same way, if I'm not mistaken.
So single rate can be a one spring or two spring.
It can be two, but it's preset and there's no way to control. You can't change the rate of the spring.
The engagement of the springs.
Correct, you can't. The only way to have a dual rate suspension system is to have a cross ring on there that limits, I guess, one of the springs.
Correct, yeah.
So once it comes up far enough, it hits that, it's like a limiter. It hits that, and then the other spring is what is, and now is the compression rate.
Correct.
And so that's the only way you can have a true dual rate
Yeah,
system.
and that's still the confusion a lot of times. So like we sell a tender spring kit. Mm-hmm. All that tender spring kit is doing is just changing the rate of the overall suspension, because it's giving you a higher rating on the tender spring, which then when you have two springs without a crossover ring, you marry them together. So if you got a 300 here pound rating, you got a 200 here, you add them together and you divide it by 2, and there's your single rate spring. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so when you're riding on it, you're riding on that single rate. So here's another example. If your bottom rate spring was 500, okay, and your top rate spring is 300, okay, so got a calculator. So 500 for the bottom plus 300 for the top, divided by 2. You're riding on a 400 rate spring, okay, versus just your bottom 500 rate, right? You're on 400 rate no matter what you do. No matter how far you run that locking coupler down or anything. You're on 400 pounds.
Right, because you can't control the load from each different spring. It's
Correct.
Just, that's what it is. Okay.
A dual rate spring, so that's a dual spring single rate setup. And that's the confusion people have, is like, oh, I'm going to put tender springs on. I have a dual rate setup. No.
Because it's got two springs, they're thinking they're set
Correct,
up.
yeah. To have a true dual rate setup is you have your 500 bottom spring, your 300 top spring, and then you have what they call a crossover ring. And then when that slide that's marrying those two springs together, let's say you're just hauling butt, you're riding on that 400. It's a little more plush and all that, right? Well, when you hit a bump, that slide hits that lock ring. Now you go to the 500 to keep you from bottoming out. That's the theory behind it, right?
Right.
So then the next question is, do you need a dual rate spring setup over a single dual spring rate? Dual spring single rate setup, it gets confusing. So which one do you need? Do you need to go all out? Honestly, probably for 95% of people that are watching this, that rides, a dual spring single rate setup is probably good enough, in my opinion, because the reality is we're not racing. Most people I know that ride, that especially rock bounds, you're not racing. And then what you don't understand is when you have a dual spring, dual rate setup, it takes a ton of tuning, because what you're doing is you're seeing the mesh point of riding on that plush, you know, dual spring single rate setup when they're both married together, to when you're stopping at a certain point and only riding on that bottom spring rate.
Right.
So where is that sweet spot at? You know, because if you hit it too quick, you're going to kill your plushness. If you hit it too long, you're going to bottom out. So what people don't understand is when you go to a dual spring, dual rate setup, it takes a ton of tuning.
And does that need change when you add things to your side by side, like with the weight, or how does that?
Yeah.
So right there, you've tuned it a bunch. You've added stuff to the machine. Now you're supposed to
another
tune it
200
again.
pounds of the rig.
Now you got to do it.
It's
all
going to
again.
change it. You know what I'm saying? So, and that's what people, you know, and I'm probably explaining it very simplistic. That's my understanding of it. If there's spring experts out there watching this and I have slaughtered it, reach out to us. We don't mind re-recording and, you know, setting the record straight. But that's my understanding of how the two spring setup works, to where you can either have a dual rate or a single rate, regardless if you have two springs or one.
To your knowledge, does any manufacturer have a true dual spring, dual rate system?
It's funny you say that. So his Pro XP has dual spring single rate setup.
Right.
My Turbo S, dual spring single rate setup. I thought all the machines were like that. Now Angry, our Pro R, we go to West Virginia. We're there 13 days. We're constantly riding. I'm breaking it in, and I just hear this slapping. I'm like, shit, this makes your stomach your stomach turn, because I'm like, is something broken? I mean, is something going wrong here? But I'm hearing something, and I could be wrong, but from what I'm looking at, I see a crossover ring, I see the slide, and it's going to hit a stopping point, and that slapping sound wasn't a consistent noise like related to a drive shaft turn or something like that. It was inconsistent, and over the terrain we were, well, guess I maybe should have.
The spring expert
Exactly.
calling it, set it straight, I guess.
Calling in now. Caller, we have you on line one. How can I help you?
That's the next series. We'll start doing that.
Exactly. Call in. I'm 99% sure the Pro R Ultimate comes with dual springs, dual rate setup. I haven't looked into it, so if I'm wrong, correct me in the comments. But yeah. And before you correct me, make sure you are looking at a Pro R Ultimate with Dynamix, with Ride Command. That's what I have. And I might have you flash up some pictures of the suspension, and you can see what I'm seeing. But if that's the case, I don't know if there's a need for any upgraded springs on the Pro R. Right. At least a two-seater. Nothing's bottoming out. Nothing's smashed down like the previous models. I think maybe they put a little more effort into this, you know, setup than other models, previous models, because to me that's pretty impressive. I've never seen that from the factory, to have a dual spring, dual rate setup from the factory.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying it's the best, because I hear the slapping, right? Like, I hear the noise. But also there's a sheave that the slide rides on. It's not just on the shock body like, you know, shock therapy. We installed that on a two-seat Rzr XP1000. It was on the shock body, and eventually that slide rubs the threads off, and usually in a hole into it, depending on how long you have the machine. You know, most machines are getting sold or traded every 2 or 3 years, so maybe you don't see the effects of that. You're buying used machines, you see the effects of it. Mm-hmm. You know. So it's pretty interesting. Just do your research, guys. Aftermarket companies will take your money and, you know, tell you need it. The reality is, do you really need it? What type of riding do you do? If you're not, I would say, if you're not hauling butt across the desert or the dunes, you know, that's your main riding area. And I'm saying hauling butt, like desert riding, apparently you go 50, 70 miles an hour at all times, and you're going to hit whoops and all that stuff.
Right. Yeah.
That's not our riding. I mean, we can open up in some places, but when you're in Tennessee, West Virginia, Arkansas,
20 or less in most places.
Exactly, Oklahoma,
yeah,
even in Texas, mud or not mud, like we're just not opening these things up to make it $1,000 purchase worth it for something I might experience for a few seconds. You know what I'm saying? So just something to think about. If you're looking for a more plush ride and you don't have a Pro R, you might just need to upgrade your tender springs. That's the reality. If they're smashed down, well then you just ride on that bottom spring, and if it's a heavy spring, there's your plushness. It got stolen from you, right? So putting that dual spring single rate setup will cut that spring weight down to allow for a more plush ride. That's why you see so many people out there, like when I added tender springs, it just felt smooth. Well, that's the reason why it felt smooth, because it just cut their spring rate in half, allowed them for a more plush ride. And so, the springs we use, we list on our website. We've ran them for years. Now, all springs, once you install, after a few months, will settle down. So, things to look out for if you do a spring change is once you install the springs, measure your height front and back. On the Turbo S, I think it was 16.5 in the front, 16 in the rear. Okay. And then in 2 or 3 months, go remeasure. You might have to do one last adjustment, but once you do that, you'll be good for a few years. The reality is, but those are wearable parts just like anything else, just like a belt, axles, all those things. Obviously, your springs is taking the brunt of it. And there's a lot of people that don't understand shocks, for them really to perform at their peak deal, need to be serviced once a year, depending on how often you ride. We service ours every 2 years because we only take 3 or 4 big trips a year. So, and if you have Dynamix, that's a whole other deal, right? Like that's a whole other situation on how to service them, that I would definitely only have a professional do it, because you could tear up that dynamic shock quickly if you try to service it yourself. So I know that was a lot of information.
Glad I can contribute.
What were we talking about?
Man. It's just, there's a lot to it, and that's it. Like I didn't have a very good understanding of it. I still may not, but that was my understanding of just recently looking into kind of different options.
Yeah.
Is it didn't make sense. I saw 2 springs. I thought, oh, dual rate, and then that's just not the case necessarily.
No, it's not. And then it's just like I see people all the time. They're spending $1,000, $1,500 on to change theirs from a dual spring single rate setup to a dual spring dual rate setup when it's you ride trails.
Like
you ride trails. You don't get over 20 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Like, you want more plush than anything. You know what I'm saying? And I'm not knocking the people that spend the money, but
no.
If you got the money and you can spend it, you can afford it, hell, spend the money, right? But, for the guys out there that are running tight with accessories, it's not going to add the value that you think you're adding. Maybe you go to sell it, someone that doesn't know what they're looking at, we're like, oh, that's awesome, but it doesn't add. Not in my opinion, it doesn't add it. For what you're paying to what other accessories you can add on.
Right.
Yeah. So it's interesting out there. Aftermarket companies will take as much money as you want to give them.
Yeah. Every time.
Every time.
They never turned me away.
Yeah. They're not going to say, no, you don't need that. So that was one of our purposes of starting Trail Kings is, us learn it and then give feedback to where maybe you don't buy something you necessarily don't need.
Right.
So, you got any other thing you want to add?
No, I mean, I've learned something from this podcast. So hopefully other people have too. Like, it just kind of solidifies knowing like the differences between them, and it's just.
I was wondering why my back was sore this one.
It's carrying the whole episode for sure. But I mean, it's helpful to be able to know. Okay, do I really need to do this? Do I really not need to do this?
Yeah.
So that's good.
You're better off using that money to buy some spare axles than, a huge. Yeah, think about it. What I think tender springs are running 260 now,
Yeah, somewhere around
259,
there,
something
yeah,
like that.
the
Like
twos.
that's probably the best bang for your buck when regarding, performance of the suspension.
Right.
And there's others out there that are more expensive, and what makes some probably more expensive is they're longer or a different rate.
Right.
At the end of the day, and when you're trying to figure out what rate you go with,
That's I was gonna say, how do you
that,
looking at a computer screen, like how do you figure that out?
They're not going to tell you because that's their secret sauce, right? They're not going to tell you. And maybe call, they might spit it
Try
out
to
there,
help you
but
out,
most people aren't going to share that. Most companies aren't going to share their rate because that's their secret sauce. But I'm telling you now, like it's not that complicated. Like the ones we sell, they're going to give you a plus ride. And are you going to know a micro difference between, a 300-pound tender spring or a 350-pound tender spring?
Right.
Like I tell you right now, if you're not in racing and deal with springs all the time, I would put money on you're probably not going to know a difference. You know what I'm saying? So then it becomes like, what am I trying to accomplish? What's the most bang for my buck I can spend the money on?
Yeah. Yeah. What's your goal? Work it backwards from there. Yeah.
Exactly. If you like a certain brand and you trust that brand, hell, go with that brand. Like, even if it's more expensive. We're not saying one brand's better than the other.
Right.
Or one's worse than the other about the pricing. Like, go with who you trust. Go with who you think is going to give you the best warranty. And so that's always been my philosophy. So,
yeah.
Well, that is the difference between a dual spring, dual rate setup versus a dual spring, single rate setup. If you have questions, drop them in the comments. If we said something incorrectly, we did not mean to. Drop that in the comments and we'll set the record straight. So we appreciate your watching. Until next time, stay safe on the trails.